however, did marry when they came of age, and my eldest, Rivka, married a young fisherman. My son-in-law, Peter, and his brother Andrew had fishing in their blood. But they had limited resources and were struggling to get a foothold in the trade. We gave them everything we had left over of my husband's equipment. Some casting nets and a trammel net with weights and sinkers and cork floats in good repair, a sail, oars, and a fishing boat in need of considerable repair. Peter and Andrew came to live with us, and we became a family business. My daughters and I went to work separating the catfish and the eels from the clean fish with scales. We dried and counted and salted the fish, packing them in baskets for export to Rome and Jerusalem. My son-in-law's skill and reputation grew as a fisherman, so much so that Zebedee, the biggest fisherman in town, took note of the growing competition. He invited Peter and Andrew to partner with him and his sons, James and John. Life, at last, was comfortable and enjoyable. My kitchen was always full of fishermen telling their stories of mighty storms and great catches. It did my heart good to see them well-fed and contented. Remembering the lean years, I was happy to host dinners, serving my best meals to friends, visitors, business partners, instead of customers. There was always room for a few more at our table. In the spring of the 35th year of the reign of Herod Antipas, while helping to dry the nets, I got my arm caught on a stray fish hook, and I ripped a sizable wound in my arm. I soon came down with a fever and collapsed in the kitchen, unable to stand. I don't remember much. What I do remember is that I was unable to move, or eat, or talk. My daughters were terrified, but I knew that whatever happened to me, they would be safe. I was fully aware that I was dying, when quite suddenly I felt a hand on mine. It was a man's hand, and I saw his face, his intense eyes looking into mine. But I was unable to say anything to him, to explain my condition to him, to warn him. He took my hand in his, and then, as he lifted my arm, I found myself offering my other hand. And he pulled me gently into a sitting position, and before I knew it, I was standing, and I was walking with him around the room. I gave a little jump just to test my strength and found myself giggling like a child taking her first steps. The young man chuckled as I jumped again and began to dance around the room. Quite without shame, I ran to him and embraced him. "Who are you?" I said, "and what is this that you have done for me?" He embraced me back, saying, "God is good all the time." And he left my room to join Peter and Andrew and James and John in my sadly neglected kitchen. I washed and dressed, and as I came into the kitchen, I was greeted with applause, more embraces, and joyful tears. It was then I was introduced to the man who saved my life, Jesus. Indeed, I am triumphant. A woman so very grateful to be alive again, able to do what gives me the greatest pleasure, offering friends and strangers comfort, helping them weather life's storms. Storms will come. They may be mild or they may wreak havoc, but eventually they will pass. That is the time when we need help to sort through the devastation left in the wake of the storm. On a day when I believed I would take my last breath, the grace of God entered my room, and redemption found his way into my heart. My life goes on, and I have only Jesus to thank.
While Peter was below in the courtyard, one of the servant girls of the high priest came by. When she saw Peter warming himself, she stared at him and said, "You also were with Jesus, the man from Nazareth." But he denied it, saying, "I do not know or understand what you are talking about." And he went out into the forecourt. Then the cock crowed. And the servant girl, on seeing him, began again to say to the bystanders, "This man is one of them." But again he denied it. Then after a little while, the bystanders again said to Peter, "Certainly you are one of them, for you are a Galilean." But he began to curse and to swore an oath, "I do not know this man you are talking about." At that moment, the cock crowed for the second time. Then Peter remembered that Jesus had said to him, "Before the cock crows twice, you will deny me 3 times." And he broke down and wept.
Yes, I met Jesus. I was married with 2 young children when I noticed a dark patchy spot on my arm. I covered the spot, thinking it was a bug bite of some sort. It would eventually disappear. But when the scaly patch appeared on my face, I couldn't hide it, and knew there was something terribly wrong. I went to the priests, made sacrifices, wondering what sin I had committed, or what sin my ancestors had committed, that I should be so stricken with sores. I spent 2 weeks with the priests, where they observed me and gave me treatments for my skin. That's what they had to do in order to make a decision about what to do with me. They were not unkind when they told me it was leprosy. There was nothing to be done. I had to leave the village and my family. And I told no one but my wife. Let everyone believe that I had simply disappeared one day. The priest took me to a place several miles outside of town where there was a colony of people like me and dropped me off. The leader of the colony, Jeremiah, greeted me. I was devastated, in shock, barely able to function. This just couldn't be happening. I don't know what let it loose. Fear, rage, terror, but I heard an anguished cry escape from the center of my soul and crescendo into an endless scream. Then everything went black. I awoke in the morning, swaddled in blankets, on a mattress of straw, and was offered bread and a cup of honeyed wine, the best I had ever tasted. Mortified, I arose, still a bit shaky, and Jeremiah led me out into the fresh morning air. What I saw next was amazing, and made me feel even more ashamed of my emotional display the evening before. These lepers were hard at work, tending to a small vineyard in a field of wheat. They grew their own food, made their own wine, and dried their own fruits. They were trying their best to sustain themselves. After a few days, I was working in the vineyard. Eventually, I took on the job of welcoming and caring for any newcomers brought to the colony. My wife was a brave woman who came to see me every week in the wee hours before dawn. Through her tears, she shared the stories of our children's adventures and assured me that they were all right. When she suddenly stopped coming, I didn't know what to think. Maybe she was ill. Maybe she had moved away. Desperate to know, I left the colony in the middle of the night, walking towards town. In the dark, I got lost and couldn't find my direction. As I sat cold and shivering, waiting for the sun to rise, I heard footsteps and saw the figure coming toward me. He stopped and sat down on the ground, and I heard him talking to himself. No, he wasn't talking to himself. He was singing. It was a familiar hymn. The tune and the words were soothing. I could feel a calm coming over me as I began to sing with him. And he didn't stop when I joined in. We were still singing when the morning sun peeked out from behind the hills. And that's when I recognized him. He was the rabbi who was teaching in the synagogue the day I first went to the priests. People said he was a healer who cast out unclean spirits. But who was more clean than I? I ran to him and fell to my knees. If you choose, you can make me clean. He looked at me with sorrowful eyes, stretched out his hand to touch me. I flinched, uncertain. If he touched me, would he be made clean and catch the disease? As his hand touched me, he spoke. His voice was powerful and strong. I do choose. Be made clean. And I was clean. The patches of gray skin were gone, and I felt whole from the inside out. We walked together into town, and I brought him to my house. My wife hadn't been ill. She'd been very busy giving birth to our son. We named him Jesus, after the man who would have given us life again. You may ask what I do now. I have traveled to all of the neighboring towns, telling my story to everyone who would listen. I worked as a fisherman with Zebedee, working one of his travel boats with a crew of 3 others. It's a good job, and he's a generous boss. He allows me to take a full basket of fish once a week out to Jeremiah and the folks I call my other family on the outskirts of town. They, in turn, give me some of their best honeyed wine for Zebedee and for me.
As soon as it was morning, the chief priest had a consultation with the elders and the scribes and the whole council. They bound him, led him away, and handed him over to Pilate. Pilate asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" He answered him, "You say so." Then the chief priests accused him of many things. Pilate asked him again, "Have you no answer? See how many charges they bring against you?" But Jesus made no further reply, so that Pilate was amazed. Now at the festival, Pilate used to release a prisoner for them, anyone for whom they asked. Now a man named Barabbas was in prison with the rebels who had committed murder during the insurrection. So the crowd came and began to ask Pilate to do for them according to his custom. Then he said to them, "Do you want me to release for you the king of the Jews?" For he realized that it was out of jealousy that the chief priests had handed him over. But the chief priests stirred up the crowd to have him release Barabbas for them instead. Pilate spoke to them again. "Then what do you wish me to do with the man you call the king of the Jews?" They shouted back, "Crucify him!" Pilate asked them, "Why? What evil has he done?" But they shouted all the more, "Crucify him!" So Pilate, wishing to satisfy the crowd, released Barabbas for them. And after flogging Jesus, he handed him over to be crucified.
My father was a stonemason, carving mortars and pestles, mill wheels to grind flour, and olive presses from the plentiful lava rock around Capernaum. He had 4 sons, all of whom he hoped would be stonemasons, and he dreamed of the day when he would place the sign over the door that read, "Nahum and Sons Stoneworks." We were 6 children, devoted to our parents. Our dad worked very hard from dawn until well after dusk, building his business, keeping the vision of the day he would welcome his oldest sons as his partners. When he was 14, my eldest brother Benjamin took me aside and confided, I don't want to be a stonemason. I want to go to sea and sail ships. When I asked him where on earth he had gotten that notion, he said, King Solomon's Navy. They were talking about it in our history class. But Dad is expecting all of you boys to work with him, I answered, still astonished by his proclamation. Ben rolled his eyes and nodded. When Ben announced his dream to become a sailor, my father answered, over my dead body. And that was the end of the discussion. Josh was the next eldest boy. Naturally strong and muscular, he eventually grew taller than Ben. As a little boy, he loved going to the stoneworks with my dad, but he always came home banged up with bruises and scrapes. Dad chalked it up to Josh being a boy who loved to climb around on stuff. One day, my father's apprentice, Isaiah, came running toward my father carrying Josh in his arms, blood streaming from his head. When my father asked what happened, Isaiah said, I was watching him climb around on the rocks. He was having a great time when suddenly he stiffened and fell to the ground. I ran over to him and found him, his eyes rolled back, his muscles twitching and his arms flailing about. He hit his head when he fell. I have never seen anything like it. I thought he was dying. When he stopped twitching, he was still breathing, so I ran over here to you, but he won't wake up. My father took Josh to a local physician who said Josh had epilepsy. There was no treatment or cure except to have the unclean spirit inside him removed. My father's response to that prescription was to never let Josh near the stoneworks again. Ben tried once more to reason with my father, but Dad cut him off, and Ben left home without another word. I know my father was broken-hearted, but he never spoke Ben's name again. He began spending more time at the stoneworks than at home. He stayed out very late, returning home only after the family had gone to bed. He was often drunk, bumping into the furniture and cursing the pain. As the years passed, my two youngest brothers, Abel and Nahum Jr., had only a distant, but always respectful relationship with my father. It was as if he had lost interest in bringing his sons into the business. Isaiah and I were to be married. He had become my father's right hand, hardworking, trustworthy, and handsome. We met when he was kind enough to bring my father home on those nights when Dad was sodden with too much wine. Unbeknownst to my father, Isaiah spent time with Josh, Abel, and Nahum, teaching them everything he knew about stonemasonry. One dreary spring morning, my father woke up and couldn't move. He could speak and move his head, but his legs and his arms seemed to be tied to the bed. The look in his eyes was one of terror. I had never seen my father so vulnerable, so afraid. Days turned into weeks with no change. He gave instructions to Isaiah on managing the business, and, in turn, Isaiah relied on Josh, Abel, and Nahum to help him keep the stoneworks running. Despair crept into my father's eyes, as if his spirit was being drowned in a sea of regret. Josh came home from the synagogue one day, talking about a man called Jesus, who healed a man with an unclean spirit that very day. Josh convinced us to bring Dad to Jesus to see if he could heal him. We searched for Jesus, but to no avail. Someone told us he had gone away. Just when we were about to give up hope that Dad would get well, we heard Jesus had returned to Capernaum. That evening, Isaiah, Josh, Abel, and Nahum came to Dad's room carrying a board with a straw mat lashed to it. They lifted what was left of the once seemingly indestructible, unbreakable man onto the matted board and carried him to a house across town. There were crowds of people lined up outside the door. When we saw the crowds, we nearly gave up, until Josh suddenly jumped up onto the roof, shouting, "Okay, everybody, lend a hand and help us lift my father up onto the roof." Isaiah, Abel, and Nahum joined Josh, and the 4 men hauled my father, board and all, up onto the roof. Isaiah and Josh used pickaxes to cut a hole in the roof's thick thatching. There was great commotion inside the house and outside over the destruction of the roof, causing the crowds to disperse, clearing a narrow path to the door. I slipped into a spot near the door and watched as Isaiah and my brothers lowered my father through the hole and set him gently down on the ground in front of Jesus. I saw him look up at the 4 faces peering through the hole in the roof. Their worried expressions disappeared, giving way to expressions of calm, relief, and absolute trust. His eyes lingered for a moment on Josh, and he smiled at him as if he recognized him. Then he turned his gaze onto my father and said, "Son, your sins are forgiven." My father looked into his eyes, his expression strained, his brow furrowed, full of questions. Some scribes in the room seemed to take offense at Jesus' words. I confess none of us had any idea what to expect. We figured Jesus would, at the very least, touch my father, but he didn't. Suddenly, I saw my father's expression change. His eyes were bright and alive. His expression was glowing. A visible tranquility came over the whole body as if he was letting go of some terrible weight. It was as if in that moment he let go of every regret, every disappointment, and unfulfilled expectation. I swear I saw him give Jesus a knowing wink, as if waiting for that particular sign. Jesus said, "Stand up and take your mat and go." Miraculously, my dad stood up, picked up the mat, and waved to my brothers to come down off the roof. On the way home, we walked past the stoneworks to show Dad the new sign hanging over the door. It read, "Nahum and Sons Stoneworks."
Then the soldiers led him into the courtyard of the palace, that is, the governor's headquarters, and they called together the whole cohort. And they clothed him in a purple cloak, and after twisting some thorns into a crown, they put it on him. And they began to salute him. "Hail, King of the Jews!" They struck his head with a reed and spat upon him and knelt down and homage to him. After mocking him, they stripped him of the purple cloak and put his own clothes on him. Then they led him out to crucify him. They compelled a passerby who was coming in from the country to carry his cross. It was Simon of Cyrene, the father of Alexander and Rufus. Then they brought Jesus to a place called Golgotha, which means the place of a skull. And they offered him wine mixed with myrrh, but he did not take it. And they crucified him and divided his clothes among them, casting lots to decide what each should take. It was 9 o'clock in the morning when they crucified him. The inscription of the charge against him read, "The King of the Jews." And with him they crucified 2 bandits, one on his right and one on his left. Those who passed by derided him, shaking their heads and saying, "Aha, you who would destroy the temple and build it in 3 days, Save yourself and come down from the cross. In the same way, the chief priests, along with the scribes, were also mocking him among themselves and saying, he saved others, he cannot save himself. Let the Messiah, the King of Israel, come down from the cross now, so that we may see and believe. Those who were crucified with him also taunted him.
No matter what anyone tells you, and no matter how many times you ask, you never really understand why a person does a thing. The why of anything can only be understood by the person who does it. Why the Master called me to follow him is still a mystery to me. Why I decided to follow him is still another. Believe me when I tell you that I am not keeping some intricate secret. It's just that I can't give you a rational explanation for what I did. There are those who look down on their righteous noses at those of us who collect the taxes Caesar levies on us. Quite frankly, I think we are preferable to a legion of Roman soldiers, which was always the alternative. All right, maybe I exaggerate, maybe they wouldn't send a whole legion of soldiers, but they would sure send plenty. As members of the tribe, so to speak, we tax collectors see ourselves, some would say falsely, as keepers of the peace. As long as we were the ones collecting for Caesar, the soldiers didn't have to do it, and our people would be relatively safe. To our way of thinking, it was just that simple. Taxes were and are as inevitable as death, and the Caesars exacted them from us as did the Ptolemies and the Seleucids before them. Collecting taxes was a service provided for the local and state government. Our work required fastidious record-keeping and a full understanding of various kinds of taxes. The ground tax on property, and of course the income tax, import and export duties, and taxes levied on all that was publicly sold and bought. Farmers paid 1/3 to 1/2 of their taxes in produce, whether grain, livestock, fruit, or wine. The remainder they paid in coin. Merchants always paid in coin. Local taxes were required to maintain public buildings like the synagogue and to keep the roads in the city's walls in good repair. The crown tax was required to support the Roman emperor and our king. On top of the civil tax, one had to pay religious taxes. The coffers for both could be found side by side in the temple in Jerusalem. My father and I made a good living. We did not live lavishly in comparison to some of the more unscrupulous publicans, but we were quite comfortable. I think the most difficult part of our work was dealing with those who could not pay their taxes. Interest accrued on unpaid taxes, but we were willing to work out payment plans to assist those who would prefer to pay their taxes in smaller parts. If taxes went unpaid, the consequences were severe, including imprisonment and the loss of one's home, property, and often one's family members who might be sold into slavery. This occurred more often than I care to remember. Our A&L tax office, that's Alphaeus and Levi tax office, was on the caravan route connecting Damascus with the Mediterranean. We were situated perfectly at a major point of entry into Palestine from the north and from the east. The day I met the Rabbi, Jesus, it didn't take me long to figure out who it was, since he traveled with a small entourage followed by a big crowd. Everyone was talking about him. You hear a lot in the tax office. I remember one day a fellow looking me straight in the eye and said, "That Jesus can make diseases disappear. I wonder if he would do the same to you." We were immune to such barbs and sarcasm. We knew they said such worse things about us behind our backs. All foot traffic and wheeled vehicles were required to stop at the tax office and pay the head or merchant tax, whether they were planning to stay in town or just passing through. The day he came to the office, I didn't even look up from my ledger, but held out my hand to receive his tax to be recorded on the page. I knew someone was standing there, but his hands were resting on the counter, palm down. Since he made no move to retrieve the coin from his purse, I looked up and saw, for the first time in many years, a face that was smiling as if genuinely glad to see me. We had never met, but he looked at me as if he had known me all my life. His face gleamed, and I was speechless. I am never speechless. But I was so disarmed by his presence and his demeanor that I just stood there, awestruck. After a long and puzzling silence, he reached out his hand and said, "Levi, follow me." I did. I can't tell you why, but I have followed him since that day. I have followed him all the way. I have never looked back on what I left behind, what might have been, or what could have been had I not followed Jesus. Why did he choose me? I was one of the most hated men in Capernaum, and the most likely to be scorned. Nevertheless, he picked me. In the end, I am still left wondering what it was all for. He's been taken from us and murdered by those who were afraid of him. I have no answers. I can only say tonight my sorrow is greater than any I have ever known. In this moment, I am more afraid as one who followed Jesus than I ever was being a tax collector for Caesar. But there is no turning back for me now.
When it was noon, darkness came over the whole land until 3 in the afternoon. At 3 o'clock, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, "Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani," which means, my God, why have you forsaken me?" When some of the bystanders heard it, they said, "Listen, he's calling for Elijah." And someone ran and filled a sponge with sour wine and put it on a stick and gave it to him to drink, saying, "Wait, let us see whether Elijah will come to take him down." Then Jesus gave a loud cry and breathed his last. And the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. Now when the centurion who stood facing him saw that in this way he breathed his last, he said, "Truly, this man is the Son of God." There were also women looking on from a distance. Among them were Mary Magdalene, and Mary the mother of James the younger, and of Joseph and Salome. These used to follow him and provided for him when he was in Galilee. And there were many other women who had come up with him to Jerusalem.
When evening had come, and since it was the day of preparation, that is, the day before the Sabbath, Joseph of Arimathea, a respected member of the council, who was also himself expectantly waiting for the kingdom of God, went boldly to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus. Then Pilate wondered if he were really dead, and summoning the centurion, he asked him whether he had been dead for some time. When he learned from the centurion that he was dead, he granted the body to Joseph. Then Joseph bought a linen cloth and laid it in a tomb that had been hewn on a rock. He then rolled a stone against the door of the tomb. Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Jesus, saw where the body was laid.
I was born and raised in the village of Bethsaida, which means house of fishing. When I was about 7 years old, I had an illness marked by high fevers and rashes. I was sick for a very long time, and when the fever stopped and the rash left me, I was blind. When I was allowed outside once again, my childhood friends were standoffish, as if my blindness might be catching. I didn't know any better and just kept inviting myself to play with them. My other senses grew sharper. My hearing was better than anyone else's, as was my sense of smell, especially for fresh baked goods. When they took me fishing with them, I could sense a change coming in the weather and was indispensable in our adventures. I regularly listened to the scribes and loved learning about God, the law, and the heroic stories of our ancestors. I imagined that I might be a scribe or a scholar, realizing that as an adult, I probably wouldn't be making a living as a human barometer or weather vane. I walked with friends to the lakeside in the mornings and fish and dream, and they usually accompanied me home in the evenings. Some days my catch was very good, and I could trade fish for bread, vegetables, and sometimes a few coins. I lived in my parents' house and shared what I had with them. One day, I realized that they were becoming quite frail and unable to care for themselves. My mother was in pain most of the time and could no longer cook or take care of the house. My father had been a weaver, but when he suffered a stroke, he was no longer able to complete a project. His memory was failing, and sometimes he didn't know if it was day or night. As the only child, it fell to me to take care of them. I had not been a desperate man, never resentful of the past or the illness that caused my blindness. I was used to my limitations, but I realized that since the age of 7, I had been focused on myself, how I would make it through my day, never mind helping anyone else get through theirs. I cannot forget the day friends dropped by, wondering why I had missed days walking with them to the lakeside. They shrieked when they saw me attempting to cook something. My fingers, hands, and feet were dotted with burn blisters earned from my mistakes at the stove. From that day on, my friends pitched in when they could to help us survive, eat a decent meal, and have clean clothes to wear. One day, they came to fetch me, saying, "We want you to come with us to see the rabbi they call Jesus." There was a great crowd in town, and they shuttled me, 2 on each arm, pushing through the press of bodies. We stopped abruptly, and I heard them plead with the Rabbi Jesus. "Can you make him see again? He is so good and kind. And just look at those burns he got trying to cook meals for his mother and father. Please help him if you can." I felt my friends let go of my arms, and another hand grasped my arm, leading me slowly away from the crowd. The touch was gentle, yet reassuring, and he talked to me as we left the village. What on earth were you trying to cook? It looks like a good deal of it landed on you, not the plate. Tell me about your parents. After about 15 minutes, we stopped, and he let go of my arm. Now I'm going to touch your eyes, he said. His warm, wet fingers moved over my eyelids. Then he covered my eyes with his hands. He removed his hands and asked, "Can you see anything?" In fact, I could see light and looked around me, but I didn't know what I was seeing. If they were people walking by, they looked more like trees than people. He placed his hands over my eyes once again and held them there for a long time. When I opened my eyes at his command, I strained to look at him. I tried to focus on my eyes on his face, wanting to see the one who was trying so hard to restore my sight. I bent my neck forward, opening my eyes wide, and suddenly his face came into focus. His eyes were intent on mine, and there was a smile on his face. I am certain his expression mirrored the one on my face. Tears welled up in my eyes, rolling down my cheeks, as I saw the gift of all things bright and beautiful now open before me. I have to go now, he said. You need to go also. Go home. Your parents are waiting for you. When I arrived, my parents were indeed waiting. My mother was up, puttering around the kitchen, and my father was at his loom. He called me over to him, and as if he knew all along that this day would come, he began to teach me the art of weaving.
Now go out into the world, remembering the eternal grace of God, the love of Jesus Christ, and the ever-presence of the Holy Spirit. Go to love and serve them with all of your heart, your soul, your mind, and your strength.